True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I have been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of time acute. I felt all things in their proper sequence and in their terrible repetition. I experienced many things more than once. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. Though story is perhaps the wrong word for what I must relate. A story has beginning, middle, end, a proper arc from cause to consequence. What I have experienced has only a middle that repeats endlessly, a loop that spirals inward like a stone dropping through water that never reaches bottom, that falls forever through darkness, approaching but never achieving rest. But I am getting ahead of myself. Or perhaps behind myself, or perhaps beside myself. For when one lives the same days over and over, when one dies repeatedly and wakes to find death undone, the proper use of tense becomes a philosophical question rather than a grammatical one. Let me begin at what I believe was the beginning, though I am no longer certain where beginning ends and repetition starts, where memory becomes prophecy, where past and future collapse into an eternal, suffocating present. I came to Andorra in February, fleeing Barcelona and the 43 families I had ruined. You must understand, I am not a violent man. I have never struck anyone in anger, never raised my voice beyond reason, never threatened or intimidated. My crimes were of paper and numbers, of investments and accounts, of trust given and betrayed. For 3 years I managed money for families who believed I would secure their futures. Instead, I transferred their savings, their children's education, their retirement, their accumulated faith in tomorrow, through a web of shell corporations to accounts in Switzerland, the Caymans, and finally, Andorra, 43 families, 2 million euros, gone. The authorities in Spain were investigating, but they would find nothing. I had been too careful, too clever. Every transaction was technically legal, every document properly filed, every signature legitimate. But I could not remain in Barcelona while they looked. Could not walk streets where mothers whose children would not attend university looked at me with eyes that held their own verdict. Could not read newspapers that called me a monster, even as they could not prove what I had done. So I fled to Andorra, to the Pyrenees, to altitude and isolation and a banking system that asked no questions as long as accounts remained in good standing. The village was called Sant Julià de Vallcivera, a name I can never forget now, though I have tried. Though I have lived through it so many times, the syllables have worn smooth like stones in a river, like prayers repeated until words become pure sound devoid of meaning. It clings to the mountainside at an altitude of 1,900 meters. 40 stone houses built from the same grey rock as the mountains themselves, as if the village were not constructed but rather carved from the slope. A temporary extrusion of the eternal stone that could be reabsorbed at any moment. A small church of Romanesque construction dates from 1127. Saint Michel they call it, with walls a metre thick and a bell that rings the hours in a tone that sounds less like summons than like warning. One shop sells groceries and hardware and tobacco. One cafe serves coffee and brandy to men who have lived in these mountains all their lives and look at outsiders with the wary assessment one reserves for avalanche-prone slopes. They know you will not last. They are simply waiting to see how you will fail. I rented a chalet from an old woman named Montserrat Vidal. She was perhaps 70, perhaps 80. The mountain ages people strangely, preserving some while wearing others down to essential elements. She spoke Catalan primarily, her Spanish heavily accented and formal, as if learned from books rather than conversation. "You are running," she said when I came to see the chalet. Not a question, a statement. "I am taking an extended vacation," I replied in my best Castilian Spanish, the kind they speak in Madrid, the kind that marks you as an outsider everywhere else. "I need quiet. I am writing a book." "Many people come to Andorra running," she continued, as if I had not spoken. Her eyes were the colour of the stone houses, grey and ancient and holding depths I did not want to plumb. "They think the mountains will hide them. That altitude puts distance between them and what they flee. That height means safety." She gestured at the peaks surrounding the village. The Pyrenees rose on all sides, not the gentle slopes of foothills, but true mountains, jagged and severe. Their upper reaches still white with snow even in February, when the village itself lay mostly bare. The nearest peak, Pic de la Cabineta, loomed directly above us, a wall of rock and ice that seemed to lean inward, to threaten to topple onto the village below. But the mountains... She paused, and I saw something flicker in her expression. Not quite fear, not quite satisfaction. Something between the two. The mountains remember, the mountains keep. And what the mountains keep, they keep forever. I thought her superstitious. A provincial old woman projecting meaning onto indifferent stone, creating narrative where there was only geology. I paid her 3 months' rent in advance, cash, which she accepted without comment or receipt, and moved into the chalet on February 10th. It was small, but adequate. 2 rooms on the main floor, a kitchen with a table that seated 2, and a sitting room with a fireplace that drew poorly, filling the space with smoke if I was not careful to open the flue completely. Upstairs, a bedroom with a narrow bed and a window that looked out at Saint Michel across the narrow cobblestone street. And beneath the main floor, accessed by a steep stone staircase, was the cellar. I did not explore it thoroughly that first day. Glanced down the stairs, saw stone walls and arched ceiling, noted it for future storage, and gave it no further thought. Old houses have old cellars. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing remarkable at all. The village was quiet in the way that only true mountain isolation can be. No traffic noise. The road from the valley below carried perhaps 3 vehicles per day in winter. No urban hum, no constant background of human activity, just wind moving through stone streets and the bell of Saint Michel marking hours, and sometimes the sound of voices speaking Catalan in a dialect so thick I could barely distinguish where one word ended and another began. I spent those first days settling in, arranging my few belongings, testing the internet connection, which was adequate if slow, checking my accounts, confirming that the money was where I had placed it, untraceable and safe, and trying not to think about Barcelona, about the families, about the woman who had come to my office in tears asking about her account, her husband's pension, their plan to retire to a small house near Valencia, about how I had shown her falsified statements, reassured her everything was fine, smiled as she thanked me and left, never knowing I had already stolen everything she had worked 40 years to accumulate. I told myself they would recover, that people are resilient, that life goes on. I told myself I had earned that money through my cleverness, my willingness to see opportunities others missed, my courage to take what was offered. I told myself many things in those first days in Sant Julià de Vallcivera, there beneath the shadow of Pic de la Cabineta, while the mountains remembered and kept their own counsel about what judgments they were preparing. February 13th came 3 days after my arrival. I woke that morning to silence, not the usual quiet of the village, but absolute silence. The kind that exists only when sound itself has been swallowed by something vast and muffling. I went to the window and saw nothing. Not darkness, not fog, just white, pure, featureless white, pressed against the glass so tightly that no light penetrated. No variation of shade suggested depth or distance. I did not understand immediately. Thought perhaps snow had drifted against the house during the night. But when I went downstairs and tried the front door, it would not open. Not locked, simply immovable, as if the entire world beyond had been replaced with something solid. And then I heard it. A sound like distant thunder, but sustained, growing. A rumble that rose from the mountain above, that vibrated through the stone walls, that grew louder and closer with each second. I had perhaps 10 seconds to understand what was happening. 10 seconds to realize that Pic de la Cabaneta had released its winter burden. That thousands of tons of snow and ice were sliding down the slope at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. That the avalanche was taking everything in its path. 10 seconds to know I was going to die. The walls held for perhaps 5 seconds under the impact. Those thick stone walls, a meter deep, built to withstand centuries of mountain weather. They cracked like eggshells. The ceiling collapsed. Snow poured through every gap, moving not like snow, but like concrete, like liquid stone, filling the space in an instant. I tried to breathe and inhaled snow. It filled my mouth, my throat, my lungs. I tried to move and found myself pinned by weight I could not comprehend. The world became white and crushing and utterly, utterly silent. I felt my ribs crack. 1, 2, 3. Distinct pops as bones gave way under pressure. Felt my lungs collapse, the air driven out and no way to draw more in. Felt my skull being compressed, my jaw forced closed, my eyes pressed back into their sockets. Pain beyond description, and worse than pain, awareness. Perfect, crystalline clarity as my brain, starved of oxygen but not yet dead, experienced every second as an eternity. I could feel individual ice crystals against my skin, could feel the weight of specific cubic meters of snow on specific parts of my body. Could feel death approaching not as darkness, but as a slow constriction of consciousness, a narrowing of being, a reduction of self into pure suffering that had no outlet, no expression, no meaning beyond itself. And then, nothing. Not death precisely, not the cessation I had expected, but rather a gap, a discontinuity, like a film with frames cut out, like a book with pages torn away, like a conversation interrupted mid-sentence and resumed hours later as if no time had passed. And then, I was waking up in the chalet bed, morning light streaming through the window that showed a clear view of Saint Michel and the village and the mountains beyond. February 10th, 3 days before the avalanche. The clock beside my bed read 7:42 a.m. I thought at first I had dreamed it. The avalanche, the burial, the death. All of it a nightmare so vivid it felt real. But when I examined my body, no bruises, no broken ribs, no evidence of trauma. When I checked my phone, February 10th, 7:42 a.m., exactly when I had woken on my first morning in the chalet, I convinced myself it had been merely a dream. Stress. Guilt manifesting as punishment in sleep. My subconscious creating elaborate penance for what I had done in Barcelona. But when I went outside, when I spoke to the shopkeeper, when I walked past Montserrat Vidal's house, and she looked at me with those grey stone eyes, I began to notice I had lived this day before, The old man who walked past at 9:15 a.m. carrying a bag of groceries said the same words, "Bon dia," the same inflection, the same nod of recognition. At 10:30, a truck passed through the village heading up the mountain, white, with advertisement on its side for building supplies. The driver raised his hand in greeting, exactly as before. At 2 p.m., clouds began forming over Pic de la Cabaneta. Not similar clouds, the same clouds. I watched them gather in precisely the same pattern, the same sequence, as if the sky itself were reading from a script. I was living February 10th again. I spent that day and the next in growing agitation, watching, waiting, testing. I spoke to people at different times, asked different questions, tried to vary my own behavior, but their responses, the villagers' actions, remained identical. The same conversations, the same movements, the same truck passing at 10:30, as if they were not real people, but rather projections, recordings, ghosts of a day being replayed. February 13th came. The silence woke me. The white at the window, the sound like thunder, the walls collapsing, the snow pouring in. This time I tried to reach the cellar, thinking the stone arches I had glimpsed might protect me. I made it halfway down the stairs before the house above came apart. The ceiling collapsed directly onto me, driving me down, burying me under tons of rubble and snow in the narrow stairwell. Different death, same result. Pinned, crushed, suffocating. My spine bent backward at an angle that sent lightning up my nervous system. My left arm trapped beneath a beam, bones splintering. My face pressed against stone that smelled of earth and age and something else. Something like time itself, like centuries compressed into scent. I died more slowly this time. Perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps 3. Time becomes elastic when measured in heartbeats, when each pulse of blood through damaged vessels is an individual eternity of pain and terror and the absolute certainty that this is real, this is happening, this is the end, and then gap, discontinuity. February 10th, 7:42 a.m. I woke screaming. I will tell you about Loop 3 in detail because it was the first time I truly understood what was happening, truly grasped the mechanism of my trap. I woke on February 10th with perfect memory of the 2 previous deaths. Not dream memory, but actual memory. As clear and traumatic as any experience of my life. I could still feel my ribs breaking, could still taste snow in my lungs, could still hear that sound like thunder approaching. I did not wait for February 13th. On February 11th, I packed a small bag and began walking down the mountain road. The nearest town, Canillo, was 15 kilometers. I would walk if necessary. Anything to be away from Sant Julià de Vallcivera when the avalanche came. The road was icy but passable. The morning was clear, temperature perhaps -5 Celsius. I made good progress, perhaps 3 kilometers in the first hour. And then the sound came. Not on February 13th, not after I had lived 3 full days, but on February 11th at 9:47 a.m., while I was still on the mountain road with the village behind me and Canillo still ahead. The avalanche came early. I turned and saw it, a wall of white descending the slope, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. It had been triggered, I realized later, by my own footsteps, by the vibration of my passage. The snowpack was unstable. Any disturbance could release it. I tried to run, made it perhaps 10 meters before it caught me. Being buried in an avalanche in the open is different from being buried in a building. There is no protection, no walls to slow the flow, no ceiling to hold up pockets of air. There is only the snow, moving like a river, like a tsunami, picking you up and tumbling you and breaking you against rocks and trees before depositing you finally in some random configuration meters below the surface. I was conscious when the snow stopped moving, found myself in darkness, in cold, in a position I could not identify. My left leg was bent at an angle that meant it was broken. My right arm was above my head, trapped. I could move my left arm perhaps 10 centimeters, could turn my head slightly, that was all. The snow around me was compressed by the force of the avalanche, packed so tightly it was almost ice. I could not dig, could not move it, could barely breathe. Exhaling was possible. Inhaling was a struggle against the weight pressing on my chest. I had perhaps 20 minutes of air in the small pocket around my face. 20 minutes to experience the full horror of premature burial, of being trapped alive in a grave from which there is no escape. I tried to dig with my free hand, managed to move perhaps a handful of snow before my fingers went numb. Tried to scream but had no air to scream with. Tried to remain calm, to conserve oxygen. But panic is not subject to reason when you are buried alive. The air went bad slowly. Each breath contained less oxygen, more carbon dioxide. My exhaled breath formed an ice pocket around my face, and I was breathing my own waste, my own poison, my body consuming itself in an enclosed system that could only end one way. I felt consciousness narrowing, felt my thoughts becoming sluggish, confused. Felt my heartbeat slowing as my brain shut down non-essential functions in a futile attempt to survive. The last thing I was aware of, the final thought before the gap, the discontinuity, was rage. Pure, impotent rage that this was how I would die. Not in Barcelona facing justice for what I had done, not in prison paying for my crimes, but here, in the Pyrenees, killed by snow and stone, and my own attempt to escape. Gap. February 10th, 7:42 a.m. I woke weeping. Loop 4. I tried to warn the village. I went to Montserrat Vidal on February 10th, the moment the shops opened. Found her in her small house near the church, sitting in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. An avalanche is coming, I told her in Spanish, speaking slowly and clearly. On February 13th, the whole village will be buried. We need to evacuate. She looked at me with those grey stone eyes and said nothing. I know you think I'm mad, I continued, but I'm not. I've lived this before. I've died in the avalanche, multiple times. I wake up and it's February 10th again and I have to live through it again. But you can help. You can warn people. You can save the village. She stood slowly, her movements careful, as if she were much older than she appeared. She poured me a cup of coffee from the pot on her stove and gestured for me to sit. Drink, she said in Catalan. I understood enough to comply. The coffee was bitter and strong. I drank it while she watched me with an expression I could not read. The avalanche, she said finally in Spanish, has come before, many times. In 1945, it came in March. In 1923, it came in January. In 1879, it came in February, like now. Other times too, back when records were not kept. The mountains shed their burden. The village is buried. Some survive, some do not. But if you know, if you've seen it before, why don't you evacuate? Why don't you leave before it comes? And go where? She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. This is our home. These are our mountains. We have lived with them for centuries. We accept what they give and what they take. You're insane, I said. All of you. You're going to die. Perhaps, she agreed. But you are already dead, are you not? You died in Barcelona when you stole from those families. You died in your soul. in your conscience, in whatever part of you was still human. And now the mountains are teaching you what death means, teaching you that consequences cannot be fled, that guilt has weight, that some debts must be paid. I stood, knocking over the coffee cup. I'm going to the police. I'm going to force an evacuation. There are no police in Sant Julià de Vallcivera, she said calmly. The nearest station is in Andorra la Vella. By the time they came, if they came, February 13th would have passed. And besides, she looked at me with something like pity. They would not believe you. They would think you mad, and they would be correct. I left her house and went to every other house in the village, 40 houses. I knocked on every door. I told everyone who would listen that an avalanche was coming, that they needed to leave, that I had seen the future and knew what would happen. Some looked at me with confusion, some with concern, some with the wary assessment one reserves for the mentally unwell, but none believed me. None took action, none left. On February 13th, the avalanche came. It buried the village, killed them all, killed me. This time I died pinned under a collapsed wall, my lower body crushed, my upper body free enough to watch the snow pour in, to see death approaching, but unable to do anything but wait for it. Gap. Discontinuity. February 10th, 7:42 a.m. Loop 5. I barricaded myself in the cellar. I spent February 10th and 11th preparing. Brought down water, 10 litres in bottles, food, bread, cheese, dried meat, enough for a week, a flashlight with extra batteries, blankets, a crowbar to dig with once the avalanche passed. The cellar was perhaps 3 meters by 4, with a ceiling of stone arches that had stood for centuries. The walls were carved from living rock. If anything in the village could survive an avalanche, it was this. On the evening of February 12th, I descended the stairs and sealed the door behind me with furniture dragged from above. Sat in the darkness. I had not yet turned on the flashlight, wanted to save the batteries, and waited. The avalanche came on schedule. I heard it above, the thunder, the impact, the house being torn apart. I heard snow pouring in through gaps, heard walls collapsing, heard the village being destroyed, but the cellar held. The stone arches did not collapse. The walls did not crack. I remained alive, trapped but breathing, in a space perhaps 2 meters high with rubble blocking what had been the entrance. I turned on the flashlight and examined my prison. The arches were intact, but the stairwell above was completely filled with debris. Snow and stone and the remains of the house pressed down, sealing me in completely. But I was alive. I had water. I had food. I had light. Rescue would come eventually. The village would be searched. I would be found. I survived the first day easily. The second day, I began to ration the water, realizing that help might take longer than I had anticipated. The third day, I tried to dig, using the crowbar to shift rubble in the stairwell. But every stone I moved caused others to shift, threatening to collapse the remaining space. I stopped after nearly bringing the ceiling down on myself. The fourth day, the food was gone. The water was nearly gone. The flashlight battery was dying. And no one had come. No sound of rescue. No voices calling. Nothing but silence pressing down like the weight of the mountain itself. I realized then that no one was searching, that perhaps no one had survived. That perhaps the avalanche had been larger than I thought, had buried not just the village but the entire valley, and rescue teams from other areas did not even know we were here. On the fifth day, I drank the last of the water. The flashlight died. I was in absolute darkness. On the sixth day, I began to understand what death by dehydration feels like. Your body consumes itself. Your tongue swells so large you cannot close your mouth. Your skin shrinks, becomes paper thin, cracks at every joint. Your blood thickens. Your organs shut down one by one, each failure announcing itself with waves of pain that are beyond description, because they are not pain in one place, but everywhere, in every cell, as your body realizes it is dying and screams in protest through every nerve. Your mind goes last. Even after your body has ceased functioning, after your heart has stopped beating, your brain remains conscious for perhaps a minute, perhaps longer, in absolute darkness, in absolute silence, knowing that this is the end, that this is death, that there is no reprieve, and then, gap, discontinuity. February 10th, 7:42 a.m. I woke screaming and could not stop screaming for an hour. I began to document the loops, to look for patterns, to treat this as a problem to be solved rather than a horror to be endured. Loop 6. I attempted to leave on February 10th itself, the moment I woke. Stole a car from the village, an old Land Rover belonging to the shopkeeper. The road was even icier at dawn, and I was unfamiliar with the vehicle. I made it 2 kilometers before skidding on a curve and plunging into a ravine. The car rolled 3 times. I was conscious when it came to rest upside down, my body broken in ways that meant death would take hours. The cold came first, though. Hypothermia is at least a gentle death compared to the others. Loop 7. I tried to change the day itself. Stayed awake for all 3 days, thinking if I did not sleep, I might avoid the loop. I collapsed from exhaustion on February 13th at 5:47 a.m., 11 minutes before the avalanche. Woke to the sound of thunder and had just enough time to understand I had failed before the snow buried me. Loop 8. I tried confession. Went to St. Michael, found the old priest, Father Joseph, a man perhaps 90 years old, who had been serving this parish for 60 years. Told him everything about Barcelona, about the 43 families, about the money I had stolen, about the loop, about the deaths. He listened in silence, then gave me absolution and told me to make restitution to those I had wronged. I tried to explain that I couldn't, that I was trapped, that I died before February 14th ever came. He said then I must find peace with God. I asked how. He had no answer. The avalanche came. I died with absolution granted and no peace found. Loop 9. Violence. If this was hell, if I was already dead, if none of this was real, then perhaps I could break it through transgression. I attempted to harm others, thinking perhaps guilt would break me out of the loop by adding to the weight I carried. I will not describe what I did. It changed nothing. The villagers bled. They screamed. They died. And on February 13th, the avalanche came and killed them again, and killed me. And I woke on February 10th, with the memory of what I had done adding to the burden, but changing nothing about the loop itself. Loop 10 through 15, variations, different attempts, different failures, different deaths. I tried drugs, thinking altered consciousness might break the pattern. I tried meditation, thinking clarity might reveal a solution. I tried destroying the chalet entirely, burning it on February 11th, thinking if there was no building, the avalanche might pass over me. It did not. The avalanche still came, still buried me under snow in the open, and I died as I had died in Loop 3. I tried staying in different locations. In the church, still buried. In the shop, still buried. In the open field on the edge of the village, still buried. The avalanche was not local. It was total. It buried everything in the valley. I tried accepting death, lying down on February 13th and waiting for it calmly. This changed nothing, except that I died with my eyes open instead of closed, watching the white wall approach, seeing my last moment with perfect clarity before the gap. And throughout all of this, throughout every loop, I began to notice something. The villagers were not quite real. They said the same things, moved through the same routines, responded to my questions and actions with a limited set of variations that felt less like genuine human reaction and more like branches in a program, options in a game, responses from something that appeared human but was not, that was instead some kind of recording, some kind of echo, some kind of memory playing out over and over. Only Montserrat Vidal seemed different. Only she seemed to truly see me, to know what I was experiencing, to understand. In loop 16, I went to her again. "I know what this is," I said to her on February 12th, the day before the avalanche, after I had tried everything else and failed. After I had died so many times, I could no longer recall the precise number. We sat in her kitchen, that same kitchen where I had tried to warn her about the avalanche, where she had told me the mountains remember. But this time I did not come to warn. I came to understand. "Tell me," she said, pouring coffee as she always did, as she had done in every loop where I came to this house, this kitchen, this moment. "I'm not in a time loop," I said. "Not really. Time isn't moving backward. I'm not reliving these days. No, I'm dying," I said. "In the cellar, under the avalanche. I've been dying since the very beginning, since what I thought was the first loop, the first death. I'm buried there now, right now, and all of this." I gestured at the kitchen, at the window, at the village beyond. "All of this is my mind, my consciousness, creating these loops, these attempts to escape, these variations, because it cannot accept what is actually happening." She sipped her coffee and said nothing. "The cellar," I continued. "Tell me about the cellar under my chalet. Tell me what it is, what it's for." "It is a crypt," she said simply. "One of many in the village. Sant Julià de Vallcivera is built on burial ground. Has been for 1,000 years, perhaps longer. The cellars were tombs first. The houses came later, built over them. We live with our dead. We always have." "And the inscription," I said, "on the keystone of the arch. I saw it. Aquí jouels que les montagnes recorden. Here lie those whom the mountains remember." "Yes. What does it mean?" She set down her coffee cup and looked at me with those grey stone eyes that seemed to see through time, through flesh, through the elaborate construction of my failing consciousness. "The mountains remember those who flee consequence," she said. "Those who take what is not theirs, those who ruin others and run. The mountains remember them, keep them. The avalanche buries them in the crypts, and there they lie, dying slowly, their minds creating elaborate fantasies of escape while their bodies fail in darkness." "How long?" I whispered. "How long have I been in the cellar?" "I do not know," she said. "Time moves differently in the tombs. A minute can feel like days. Days can feel like years. You could have been dying for hours, for weeks, for..." "No," I said. "That's not possible. I would be dead by now. You can't survive that long without water, without air." "You are not surviving," she said gently. "You are dying. There is a difference. Survival implies a future. Dying is only present, stretched to its absolute limit. And in that eternal present, a mind can experience many things, many loops, many attempts, many deaths." I wanted to deny it, wanted to insist this was real, that I was real, that I could still escape if I just found the right approach. But I knew. deep in whatever part of me was still capable of truth. I knew she was right. The 43 families, I said. In Barcelona. They're here, aren't they? In the village. They're what the mountains remember. They're why I'm trapped. Yes, she said, though they do not know it. They are memory. Your guilt given form. The avalanche kills them over and over because you killed their futures over and over, ended their dreams, buried their hopes. And you must watch, must experience their deaths, must fail to save them, must die with them. This is what the mountains have judged. This is what the mountains have decided you must pay. Forever? I asked. Will it go on forever? I do not know, she said. Perhaps until your body finally dies in the cellar. Perhaps longer, perhaps forever. The mountains keep what they remember, and they remember everything. I started to speak but found I could not. My throat was closing. My tongue was swelling. I was dying of thirst again. Dying as I had died in the cellar in Loop 5. My body finally catching up to what my mind had been experiencing over and over. I'm sorry, I whispered. Tell them, tell the families. I'm sorry. They cannot hear you, Montserrat Vidal said. They are not real. Only you are real. Only your guilt is real. Only your death is real. And then the sound came. That sound like thunder, that rumble that grew and grew until it was the only thing in existence. The avalanche. February 13th had come again. Or perhaps it had never stopped coming. Perhaps it was always February 13th in the cellar, always the moment of burial, always the eternal present of death approaching and never quite arriving. The walls of Montserrat Vidal's kitchen cracked. Snow poured in through the windows. The ceiling collapsed. I was buried again, died again. Gap. Discontinuity. February 10th, 7:42 a.m. But this time I woke with the knowledge, with the truth, with the understanding that I was not waking in the chalet, but rather my mind was cycling back to the beginning of the loop, creating the illusion of February 10th, creating the hope of escape, because my dying brain could not accept the reality of my situation. I was in the cellar, had been in the cellar, would always be in the cellar. The loops were not time, they were consciousness. My consciousness, fragmenting and repeating and trying desperately to deny what was happening to my body. And with that knowledge, everything changed. I stopped trying to escape. There was no point. Every attempt simply created another loop, another variation, another death, another gap, another February 10th. Instead, I tried to remain present, to stay in the reality of the cellar rather than the fantasy of the loops. It was difficult. My mind wanted to create the chalet, wanted to create February 10th, wanted to create the hope of survival. But I resisted. I held on to the truth. I was buried. I was dying. I was in darkness and cold and alone. And gradually, though gradually, has no meaning in the eternal present of death, I became aware of my actual body rather than the fantasy body in the loops. I was indeed in the cellar, under rubble and snow. My legs were crushed, my left arm was pinned, my ribs were broken. My skull was fractured where a beam had struck me. I could not move, could barely breathe. Each inhalation was agony, and each exhalation brought me closer to the moment when there would be no more air, no more breath, no more anything. How long had I been here? Hours, days. There was no way to know. The darkness was absolute. The cold was absolute. The silence was absolute. And the loops, The loops were my mind's last defense against accepting this reality. My consciousness creating elaborate fantasies of February 10th through 13th, of attempts to escape, of variations and changes, of hope that did not exist in the actual moment of my dying. But now that I knew the truth, now that I had accepted it, the loops began to lose their power. February 10th, 7:42 a.m. I woke for what I believed was the 20th time, perhaps the 30th, perhaps the 100th. The number no longer mattered. I woke, and instead of trying to change the day, instead of attempting to escape, I simply existed in it. Watched the villagers move through their routines, watched the truck pass at 10:30, watched the clouds gather on February 12th, and I saw them now for what they were. Not real people, but guilt given form. Not real events, but memory and consequence playing out in the dying theatre of my mind. The old man with groceries was one of the 43 families. I recognized him now, had taken his retirement savings, smiled as I reassured him his money was safe, shaken his hand as he left my office, never knowing I had already stolen everything. The truck driver was another, a man whose daughter's education fund I had emptied. Montserrat Vidal was the grandmother of a young couple whose savings for their first house had disappeared into my accounts. All of them here. All of them dying with me in every loop. All of them buried by the avalanche of consequences I had triggered when I took what was not mine and fled to the mountains thinking I could hide. February 13th came, the avalanche came, the snow buried me, and this time I did not resist, did not fight, did not rage against the dying. I accepted it, accepted that I was being crushed, accepted that I could not breathe, accepted that this was death and that death was what I deserved. The gap came, but this time, when I woke, I was not in the chalet. I was in the cellar, in my actual body, in the darkness and the cold and the crushing weight of snow and stone. And I understood there would be no more loops. My mind had exhausted its capacity for fantasy. The truth was too obvious now, too undeniable. This was the real moment, the actual dying, the final present from which there would be no escape into February 10th, no gap into discontinuity, no loop to soften the reality. I was buried alive, dying slowly. And I would remain conscious until the very end, experiencing every second of suffocation, every moment of pain, every instant of terror, because this was what the mountains had judged I deserved. The mountains remember, the mountains keep, and I am kept here, forever, in this cellar, in this darkness, in this moment that is all moments collapsed into an eternal present of dying and never quite dying, of consciousness that cannot escape and cannot end, of guilt made manifest as geological punishment. I try to scream but have no air to scream with. I try to move, but the weight is too great. I try to die, but death will not come. Not completely. Not ever. There is only this. Only the crushing weight. Only the darkness. Only the knowledge that this is justice. That this is consequence. That this is what happens when you flee into mountains that remember and keep and judge. Can you hear it? That sound like distant thunder. That rumble that never stops, that grows and fades and grows again but never fully passes. The avalanche. It is always coming, always burying, always crushing. I am in the cellar beneath Sant Julià de Vallcivera. I have been here for seconds or hours or years. I will be here forever. The mountains remember, the mountains keep, and I am what they keep, screaming in silence. Dying forever, never released. Help me, please, someone, anyone. The weight is crushing. The air is gone. The darkness is absolute, and there is no end. No end. No